From one perspective, if you look at my life, it's the perfect testing ground for what works in the long-term learning process. I began playing chess when I was 6 years old. I started playing tournaments when I was 7. At the age of 8, I was playing in national championships, top board, a lot of pressure. And I went on to play professionally in the chess world for 17 years, and I moved into the martial arts, and I started competing very intensely, and there ultimately in national and world championships. And what's interesting is if you look back on my careers in chess and the martial arts, I've won a lot of games, a lot of titles, a lot of big tournaments, but what's funny is that I can hardly remember the wins. They don't really matter in my mind. What matters are the losses. The losses are what have defined me as a human being. They've spurred me to interesting revelations about the learning process, about myself, about exploring my psychological wrinkles. So if you kind of step back and you look at my long-term growth process in these two arts, and you separate yourself from the pain of the tough losses and the elation of the big wins, what's been fundamentally critical have been the brutal losses that have forced me to take on my weaknesses and grow. When you think about the learning process from that perspective, it's somewhat liberating because it frees you up from the ego's need to win, to be right, to have everything under control, to always be on top. And you learn to love the process. You learn to embrace the wins, the losses, whatever comes, because the wins feel good always, and the losses are our best teachers. And that perspective on the learning process, if we can maintain it, and of course it's hard, I believe is very liberating and very inspiring. Chess and the martial arts, to many people, it seems very different, and of course I can understand that. The amazing thing is that they're almost the same. For many years I described the study of chess as the study of numbers to leave numbers. You're doing incredibly complex mathematical work, and then ultimately you're transcending the numbers, you're transcending the math, and you're coming to this beautiful sense of flow, as if chess is like music, or like watching waves lap against a beach, or watching a bird fly. This feeling of energetic flow is at the center of my relationship to chess. And in the martial arts, it always felt, I described it as form to leave form, or technique to leave technique. You have to embody a huge amount of information. You have to learn a lot of techniques, but then ultimately they just become internalized into your unconscious, and you are experiencing a very similar kind of flow. And what I began to experience when I transitioned from chess into the martial arts was the sense that quality in chess was quite similar to quality in the martial arts. And I had this amazing growth spurt in the first year or 2 or 3 that I was studying the martial arts, because it began to feel as if when I was doing Tai Chi Chuan, I was playing chess, and when I was playing chess, I was doing Tai Chi. I remember I was giving one simultaneous chess exhibition in Memphis about 2 years into my study of Tai Chi, and I had this bizarre revelation about an hour and a half into the simul. I was playing 40 boards at once, walking around in a square. Each person was playing against me, so they would make their move, I'd make my move, and they'd think as I moved around the tables. And I had this moment when I realized that I was winning these chess games, but I wasn't playing chess. I was feeling flow, feeling space left behind. I was riding the energy of the game like I would in the martial arts. And I became fascinated with my learning process. I started to explore what it was in these arts that really connected. At first it was very abstract to me. I experienced it as something, I called it parallel learning or translation of level. But that's hard to really put your finger on. And in the process of conceptualizing this book, what I've done is broken down my learning process, come to see the principles of learning, the principles of performance that really link these arts and link all arts, because my fundamental idea about the learning process is to break down the artificial barriers that exist in our minds between our diverse pursuits, between our work, between our life, because ultimately when you grow in one thing, it should inspire growth in all things. Well, the life of a martial artist is different from a chess player. In many ways it's the same, because you're competing all the time. You're constantly testing yourself, you're growing, you're growing, you're growing, and then you're taking your ideas and you're applying them on the mats and seeing what really works and what's just fanciful. But there's a lot more pain, a lot more physical pain. In my martial arts life, I had to deal with a huge amount of injuries, because that's part of the game. You're training very intensely on the mats every night. And bones break, ankles, knees get sprained, get torn up. And ultimately what you have to learn how to do, again, is to use that adversity to your advantage. Some of the most wonderful things that have happened to me, in hindsight, in my martial arts career, have been the setbacks, have been the injuries, been the times when for example, when I broke my hand, it was in this super heavyweight tournament of a major event that I was competing in. It was 6.5 weeks before the national championship that I had to defend my title in, and I was in the finals against a 230-pound bruiser. It was about 45 seconds left before the bell. I had been leading the match, and there was, in this crazy martial flurry, he popped his shoulder into my hand. I felt my right hand explode. My hand broke. And it was this trippy moment for me when time slowed down. The second my hand shattered, I felt this surge of heat through my arm, and then time slowed down in my mind. And on the tape, his hands are coming at me like bullets. I mean, he's so fast. He's an incredible martial artist. But in my mind, they were coming at me like clouds. And I was able to win the match with one hand, dodging, weaving, using his momentum. And it was an amazing experience because time slowed down in my mind. I was able to easily beat somebody much, much bigger than me. He had about 60, 70 pounds on me. And that experience of time slowing down for me became a beacon in my training. It's something that I worked on for years, learning how to make time slow down without having a broken limb or without getting hit by a car or having some kind of traumatic experience. Because the human mind, as we all know, can do these types of things. We have all heard stories of time slowing down when you're falling down the stairs or this kind of thing. And in the martial arts, I experienced it in that extreme environment. But then my challenge was to learn how to do that at will, which I learned how to do through intense training. It's something I talk about in the book. And these types of moments where I had an injury, then I had to come back from that injury. I had to train for the nationals with one hand, learning how to use my offhand, learning how to dominate two hands with one hand. When I was able finally to come back with my second hand, it felt like an unfair advantage to be able to compete against people with two hands. So this kind of setback is something which was tremendous for me. So when I think back on my martial arts life, I've had to deal with dirty players beyond belief. I've had to deal with people trying to take out my knees, targeting the groin, and continuing play after the bell in world championships. I've had to deal with every kind of dirty player imaginable in chess as well. I've had chess rivals who used to kick me under the table in world championship play. I mean, it's hilarious when the stakes are really high, what you're dealing with. A lot of people don't know about the underbelly of these disciplines. But this type of adversity, these types of dirty players, these lousy conditions, these are the things which ultimately make us resilient. They make us imperturbable in our performance state, and they give us what I call the soft zone. The soft zone is a very important idea in performance psychology. If you can think about a physical imagery, if you think about a blade of grass confronting hurricane force winds, the blade of grass will bend to the wind, no problem. No matter how hard it blows, it'll stay up, it'll just bend to it and come back, rebound. In contrast to a brittle twig that's dried out, if you put pressure on it, it'll snap and break. So if you think about the soft zone, the zone being our state of intense concentration, our performance state, the soft zone is something which is incredibly flexible, malleable. It can move to whatever comes at it. The hard zone is something which is much less resilient. In my life, I had to train very intensely at learning how to have a performance state which was resilient under the pressures that you wouldn't normally have as a child. When I was 8, 9, 10 years old, I was mostly playing in children's tournaments, but when I was 10, 11, I started playing in chess tournaments that were mostly adults. And that was a very big movement for me in my life because in children's chess, games are usually half an hour, maybe an hour and a half. Playing as adults, you're playing for 4, 5, 6 hours at a time, which can be very hard for a 10, 11, 12-year-old boy. And I was playing against very strong masters because I'd reached a pretty high level at that point. And what began to happen to me when I was focusing in the third and fourth hour of a tough game is I'd get something stuck in my mind. And all that pressure on my mind started to have this interesting thing, which that for a lot of people can relate, for example, to music, a song being stuck in their head. I would have heard some Bon Jovi song, I remember it was Scooby-Doo actually. I'd be watching cartoons at home, and I'd go in, be playing against a very strong chess master, and suddenly in the second or third hour of the game, the theme song of Scooby-Doo would start rattling away in my brain, and I just couldn't get it out. It's funny, but it was a really haunting thing for me as a player, because I just couldn't get the song out of my head. And this was a real problem for me for a period of time. And it got worse and worse. A ticking chess clock can be like a telltale heart when you're playing a chess game, or people whispering, or very often you'd be playing in a large convention hall, and there'd be a wedding in the next door convention hall. And whatever music was coming through would get stuck in my brain and rattle away, and it was something I really had to learn how to work with. First, I tried to block it out. That was very hard. And the more I tried to block it out, the louder it got in my head. Then I came to this interesting moment where I started to learn how to use the song to my advantage, to think to the beat of the song. Whatever happened in the music would just spur my mind to interesting creative places. And then I started to train over the years at that idea. In my parents' house, in my room, I'd shut the door and I'd study chess for 2 hours or 3 hours a day. And I'd do it with music playing. Sometimes it was music I liked, sometimes music I didn't like. It would be pop music, rock music, classical music. Sometimes I had these booming Gyuto monk chants, like Moi Om, these crazy, the whole room would be shaking with these chants. It drove my sister crazy. But I was learning how to think to whatever distraction was possible. And I trained myself to have what I call the soft zone, to have this state of concentration that could not so much block out, but flow with whatever kind of distraction came. And that ultimately proved really useful for me in my competitive life down the road in the martial arts and also in the chess world. I remember I was playing a huge world championship game in India. This is the World Junior Championship. I think I was 18 or 19 years old. And I was in this incredibly intense thought process about 20 minutes into my thinking. It was the critical position of the game, and my mind had entered so deeply into the position, and I was very close to coming to something, but I didn't have it yet. I'd been struggling with the position, and then there was an earthquake, and people started screaming. Fans from the bleachers above ran out, all the players started running out, and I sat there for about 10 seconds in the earthquake. And my mind started to go to these wild places, and the earthquake spurred me to revelation. I found the solution to the problem. It was an amazing moment. I left the room, and I came back, and I played the move that I had found in the earthquake, and I went on to win the game. It was a critical game of the World Championship. And this is a theme which has consistently made itself felt in my careers. And in the martial arts, I once I broke a hand in a huge match, and that broken hand spurred me to this incredible state of time slowing down in my mind, which I ultimately used in my training later to try to repeat that experience of slowing down time on my own without a broken hand. This idea of using adversity, of having a soft zone, of having a resilient state of concentration, both in the moment in terms of performance psychology, but also in the long-term learning process, using whatever comes at you to your advantage. This has been a very important theme in my life. Investing in loss is giving yourself to the learning process. It's releasing yourself from the ego's need to be right, to always win, to have everything under control. And when you're able to embrace this idea, the beginner's mind, when you're able to conceive of yourself as a beginner, even when you're very advanced, when you can understand that adversity, that setbacks are part of the long-term learning process, you're free. You're free to learn. Very often we have our strengths and we need to take on our weaknesses. For example, if you think about a great boxer who's got a fabulous right and no left, in order to learn how to throw the left, he's got to release his strengths. He's got to stop doing what he's used to. In golf, for example, Tiger Woods is a great example of somebody who was at the very top of the golf world, and he came to a moment a few years ago where he needed to break down his game. He felt like something wasn't quite right, and he broke down his swing. He had results that weren't up to his level for a while, and then he exploded, and he just became completely dominant. Very often we have to invest in loss. We have to take periods of our life where we need to take on our weaknesses, release the strengths of our game in order to have incredible leaps in the learning process down the road, but that's hard. So the idea of not having your ego invested in every moment of your learning process and not always having to be right, if we can let that go, we can have a long-term, journey-oriented approach to the learning process. It's really liberating. When I think about all the people I've seen over the years pursuing excellence, maybe the most important element that determines their success or failures is how they approach the long-term learning process, whether they associate their success with something innate, with something that they just have in them, or something that is more work-related. If people envision their road to mastery as involving hard work, as involving constantly taking on their weaknesses, growing, having setbacks and rebounding from those setbacks, they tend to be very liberated in their approach. I know for myself, when I think back, it's the losses that have defined me. But it's very hard to maintain that perspective when we're inside of the battle, inside of the grind. I think back on my most painful losses in my life. I can envision myself when I was 17 years old. I was in Szeged, Hungary, playing in the World Championship. In the last round, I was competing, World Chess Championship, and I was competing against the Russian guy on the first board in the final round. We were tied for first place, and he offered me a draw. So all I had to do to become world champion at the time was shake hands. We would share the world championship title, and I declined. I pushed for a win, and I lost the most heartbreaking loss of my life, and it was just devastating. But that element of my competitive self, I've always been someone who pushed for the win. I never really settled for draws. I was always somebody who, if it came to settling for something or pushing for more, even taking big risks, that was a big part of my personality. And that approach, I think, is something which comes from loving the journey, loving the battle, being willing to put myself on the line and endure the pain, learn from the pain, or come back. Because if you think about that moment when I was 17 years old and all I had to do was shake hands to share the world title, if I had shaken hands, I would have had some glory, but there would have been no lesson there. I wouldn't have pushed myself. I wouldn't have really challenged myself, and growth comes at the point of resistance. So in many ways, I think that the most important thing for anybody pursuing excellence is having a willingness to put yourself on the line, to test yourself, to risk losing, and to surge for excellence. But of course, that's scary sometimes, and we have to have an approach to the thing. We have to have a vision of the learning process which allows us to do that. If I had to break down my whole book into one idea that I thought was the most important thing for people to embody in their pursuit of excellence, I would say that it's to discover your true voice, to express yourself as honestly, as purely as possible. There's many answers to any meaningful question. I've come to that belief in life. And there are many ways to do any art. In the chess world, for example, the greatest players in the world are the ones who are true to themselves. For many years, Garry Kasparov and Anatoly Karpov were the two greatest players, and they couldn't have been more different human beings. Kasparov was a vibrant attacking player, incredibly aggressive, charismatic. Karpov was a personality who was much more quiet, reserved, and he was a prophylactic player, somebody who constantly stopped his opponent's ideas before they even had conceived of them themselves. He was like an anaconda squeezing the life out of opponents. If you think about the people in every discipline that you know who have been truly great, they're the people who are unimpeded in the way they express their personalities and what they do. And it's almost a cliche when someone says to follow your dreams, to trust your intuition, but I think that this idea of, in the long-term learning process, using your instincts, your intuition, your nose for what is true to you as the fundamental beacon, the thing that searches out your sense of direction in the learning process. There are a lot of teachers who try to put everyone into a cookie-cutter mold, and I don't believe in that in the learning process. I think it's much more useful and powerful and empowering to believe in your individuality and learn how to express it as truly as possible.